All right, it looks like just about everybody has joined. We'll probably have a couple more stragglers, but that's fine. So welcome to our annual masterclass. We do this every year. We've had several different iterations of this, and this is the latest and greatest. Today is Masterclass 1, an overview of integrated program evaluation. There'll be 3 more classes following this. We will have a slide deck at the end of this to make sure you are aware of the times, but you will be getting automatically registered for them as well. Couple housekeeping items. One, at the bottom, there's the chat. If you have any technical difficulties or just random comments, please fill them in. We always like feedback. Q&A, please raise your hand or submit something in the Q&A. That way other people can upvote what they would like to see. And without further ado, I will turn it over to today's instructor, founder, and author of Start, Stop, or Grow, Robert Gray Atkins.
Thank you, Ned. All those honorifics always make me feel like I'm Emperor of Japan or something. Or perhaps a character out of a Gilbert and Sullivan show. Anyway, I'm Bob Atkins. I'm the founder here at Gray. Thank you all very much for joining us today. Really appreciate it, and hope that this class will do 2 things. One, we're going to share some methods with you about how to do program evaluation and management. We're going to share the data that we think is useful in that process, about, in particular, the data on markets and economics. And in the course of doing that, I'm going to share some live data on what's going on in the market for higher education right now. So all that's going to happen. This is a class. So if you have questions, absolutely put them in the Q&A. Time permitting, I'll do them as we go through. Just recognize that if we're getting a little tight, I'll take them offline, but be glad to answer them for you in email, or you can give me a call and we'll talk in person if you'd like. Thanks very much. Let me get started. So I am Bob Atkins, and I would encourage all of you, if you're interested in this topic, please feel free to grab a copy of Start, Stop, or Grow. It's really a practical kind of how-to guide on how to do program evaluation and management. And it'll help you put the material you're going to learn today into a context and give you the time really to process it yourselves. So that's my plug for my book. I won't do any more of that. So let's talk a little bit about how to evaluate academic programs. We're going to do that in parts. First is, there are a bunch of things you may know about academic program evaluation and the data that you may want to use for that. Some of that, and by the way, we used to use many of these data sources, and then we found out that some of them are essentially mythological. They have a manifestation in today's world, but they're not actually tied to reality. So we'll explain which ones of those are myths and which are real. We'll walk you through a version of a program evaluation system and define what a program evaluation system is. We'll talk about markets, including student demand, employment, and a physical program scorecard you can see. And then we'll go through program economics and benchmarking and show you how that's done, and wrap up by talking about a really important concept, which is program portfolio management. It's our belief that program evaluation shouldn't be a one-time event or an every 5-year event. You really need an ongoing management process to keep track of your portfolio, to take advantages of changes in the market, and to avoid some of the risks that are out there. So we'll talk through how to do that. So let's talk about myths first. I think all of us are facing this. It's a source of great frustration to me that there's all this propaganda out there that, this just isn't worth it, that welders make more than philosophers. We need more welders and fewer philosophers. Well, and by the way, 46% of Americans, as of this Gallup survey, said that they thought college was worthwhile, right? So they would prefer not to send their child to college. There's a recent survey that came out where that number's up to 51%. So the trend is going in the wrong direction, with more and more people thinking college is not worthwhile. So question is this fact or myth? Well, not quite the fact that people might think it is. The actual ROI on a college degree is over $900,000. So for average debt of $35,000, you can get close to $1 million back. If there's anybody out there who has that deal and can show me where I can invest $35,000 and get $1 million back, please let me know. I will cobble together all the money that's dropped in the couch and invest in that. It is one of the best investments that I've ever heard of. So anybody who tells you a college degree is not worthwhile, please feel free to share this data. and there's lots more where this came from, that can demonstrate the tangible value of getting a college degree. And that's not including the intangibles that are also associated with college education. Little things like living longer, being happier, your marriage lasting longer, and so forth. For whatever reason, going to college either is done by people who have those propensities, or college really does help people have a better life. And it's certainly my belief. Just so you know, the source on this is the Georgetown University Center for Education in the Workforce. So it's a very reputable source, very thorough analysis, and college is worthwhile. Now let's take apart that welder and philosophy thing, just so you all have the data behind that. The U.S. median income is $41,000 a year, round numbers. Welders do fine. They make $44,000 a year, so they're solidly in the middle of the U.S. individual wage earning. Philosophy majors under the age of 30 do in fact make about the same amount as welders, not what you'd expect for having invested in a 4-year degree, but still, you know, a living income. Now, and by the way, not less than welders, which you recall is what the allegation was in the first place, made, by the way, during the US presidential debates of all places. So then you kind of say, well, what happens after 30? And the picture changes just a tinch. And we find that philosophy majors make on average $96,000, leaving the welders behind, more than 2x difference in earnings versus a welder. So if anybody thinks that welders make more money than philosophers, they've been doing a little bit too much business at the local cannabis dispensary. That's just not true. It's not close to true. And this much maligned major turns out to be a perfectly good way to earn a living and get a job. Now,
Bob, we got a quick question.
Yep.
Across what time span is this ROI calculated?
That's a lifetime. So that's from degree granting to retirement from the workforce. Coming back to the philosophy major, the other thing that's funny about this is about the number one profession, number 1 and 2 are clergy and the law. And one of the reasons philosophy majors are relatively lower is that it includes many programs are actually called philosophy and religion. So they're actually training for the to go into the clergy. If we excluded those, this number would be even higher. So this is a perfectly good major. And you might say, well, why is that? I mentioned one of the things, a lot of philosophy majors go on to grad school, law school in particular, is that's the number 1 profession for philosophy majors. But that's not the only thing. In the top 10 professions for philosophy majors, we have CEO. In many cases, that's the owner of a small business, but still CEO, not necessarily Fortune 500, that's all. And the other one is coding. In the top 10 professions for philosophy majors is software development. And you might well ask yourself, as I did when I first saw that, what the heck is the relationship between software development and philosophy? And it's a darn good question. But inside of a philosophy program, in many cases, is something called formal logic. Now, as academics, many of you may have been exposed to formal logic. Mercifully, my exposure was brief and unpleasant. It's really tough stuff. It, to me, is completely illogical. But there are things out there that think in formally logical terms. Most of them, however, are not humans. They're computers. So it turns out that understanding that way of looking at the world and being able to think through formal logical problems is really good practice for coding. So Google hires philosophy majors as a matter of practice. At least they did when they were still hiring people. And I was saying this in front of one audience, and a woman walked up to me afterwards and said, I am that person. I am a philosophy major, and I am managing a crew of software developers now. So the anecdote, if you will, is confirmed to me this is a real thing, and philosophy majors really do go into coding. And in any case, they make good money and they're employed. And last time I checked, by the way, there are about as many job postings for philosophy majors as there are for welders. So even the allegation there are more jobs is incorrect. Now, all of you have heard about the demographic cliff. This is this wonderful scare tactic. Scare tactics go back to the dawn of time. Think of Malthus predicting that we were all going to die of hunger 400 years ago. The Club of Rome saying we're all going to die of hunger by the year 2000. We're going to have, what was it? Peak oil was going to hit in 2000. You could go on. In 2000, all computers were supposed to stop. You can go on and on with these prognostications of doom. Thank heavens, they're almost all wrong. And this is one of them. The demographic cliff didn't happen. There's a tiny decline, 0.1% in ages 15 to 24. So there was a drop off, but the cliff wasn't there. And one thing I would say is, in general, when you look at demographic statistics, if somebody tells you there's a cliff, it's going to be a gross exaggeration, because demographics don't change very fast. So you may well see a steady decline, if you will, a headwind that you've got to get through. But when people look at the declines in higher ed, which in the community college sector, as an example, run 8-9% a year for the last 3 or 4 years, that cannot be explained by demographics alone. In fact, when that book was written, it focused in on that 18 to 24-year-old age group. It excluded adult learners, which is what you might call a small oversight. Adult learners are 40% of the higher education population. So they kind of set that aside. And this portion of the population is growing. Its enrollment is not growing, by the way, but the adult population itself has been growing. And as a percentage of, and overall in higher ed, it was growing up until more recently. This is the population you tend to see in online programs. So in any case, if you think about it and you say, I'm in the toilet, let me pick a good market example, something like the candy market. If I exclude the growing sectors of the market, for in this case, the older population, and I only look at the shrinking sections, it's almost any market, you're going to find that the market appears to be declining when you exclude growth. So the next time somebody talks to you about the demographic cliff, has to see the data. It may exist in your local market. It's not that it's not true anywhere, but in general across the US, it's not true. And by and large, the declines that we're seeing could not be explained by population alone. So that leads you to the idea that we do need some data that we can base our decisions on, so we don't get caught up in myths. And let me share with you what some of those are. I suppose I'm talking to the choir here when I say that we should be doing program evaluation, but it is a fair question. Why should we bother with all this? Why do we need data for this? What's the actual problem? There are a few. One is that knowledge is growing a lot faster than budgets. Conservatively speaking, knowledge in the world is growing about 4%. I think that's a very conservative estimate. That's the percentage growth in new patents at the patent office. If you looked at something like the volume of data, it's doubling every year, and the rate of doubling is accelerating. We'll probably be down to doubling every few months within the next year or two. But data is not really knowledge, so that'd be much too fast. But certainly it's 4%, and it's probably higher than that. And I think all of us would be dancing in the streets if our budgets were growing 4%. So that rate of knowledge growth is clearly faster than the money we have to fund in codifying that knowledge and teaching it. Second problem is everybody's got a favorite program. That could be an employer in your local market who wants you to teach a welding program. And oh, by the way, he needs to hire 2 welders a year, so good luck with all those graduates. There may be a board member who thinks that you should have a fashion program. By the way, not necessarily a bad program. And then there are the folks who think you should be out on the cutting edge teaching quantum computing. And that may be true. I actually think it's a really cool program, and it is a wave of the future. Question being, in some program like that, how far out in the future? It could still be 5 or 10 years away. And everything else under the sun. Faculty are very creative, your alumni are creative, your local employers are creative, and they're all coming to you saying, why don't we do this? And that raises the question of, how do we actually decide which of those are good ideas? We would suggest that's where the program evaluation system comes in. Now, the first part of that system is data. And the data we would suggest you need is data about your markets. That is, what students want to take this program, how many of them are there, who's the competition, how intense is it, what's going on in the labor market, and what do employers need, and finally, what's the appropriate degree level for this program? We'll talk about that in a little more depth in a moment. Then you get to margins, and I can hear some of you thinking, well, wait a second, we're not a for-profit business. Why should we be worried about margins on our academic programs? And it is a really good question. My colleague, Bill Massey, used to be the CFO and head of the business school at Stanford. So one who explained this to me. What we want with margins is to generate enough surplus in the programs that are large and margin positive to fund smaller and potentially even money-losing programs that are central to the mission of the institution. So think of a web of cross subsidies that are taking place in your program portfolio so that money can flow from large mission-oriented programs to small mission-critical programs that may not have the margins to support themselves. So that's a normal form of subsidy. Or if you really want to get brief about it, margins fund mission. That's their purpose. It's not to generate profits for shareholders or sinecures for administrators. Next, you need to understand academic standards and how you're performing against those. Obviously, this is near and dear to all of you. We need to know if our students are graduating from the program, if they're passing their courses, how that varies by Pell status or ethnicity, and whether those students are actually passing the relevant exams for graduates, things like the NCLEX exam for nurses. And finally, whether the program aligns with the mission of the institution. Now, I wish I could tell you there's an algorithm to take all that data and squish it and run machine learning models and tell you, here are the programs to offer. That algorithm sadly doesn't exist yet. If it did, I suspect very little attention would get paid to it in the end. But right now, it's not possible. To make good decisions, you have to have the right people involved in the right process so that that use the data, that inform their judgment based on the data, but still apply their judgment in order to make program decisions. So it's important the process is crisp, it moves relatively quickly, it's open, and the right people across the institution are involved. And that ranges from potentially the president, certainly the provost, the academic deans, admissions, marketing, and other organizations, student services, for example, that either will have insight into your program choices or will need to implement them or be affected by them. So they need to know in advance and may have a perspective on what would make for a successful program. The more inclusive and open this process is, data informed certainly, but inclusive and people oriented, the better off you'll be. Top-down decisions really don't work for two reasons. By the way, consultant decisions don't really work either, just for the record. What happens is that they cause just an organic resistance by the organization, whether it's top-down or from a consultant. And in the end, that slows the process down. It doesn't speed it up. So if your institution really believes it needs to make decisions quickly and move fast, don't do top-down. If you want to move fast, you've got to run a good process so that the whole organization is behind you. Otherwise, you'll make the decision quickly and it won't get implemented. So what's inside a market? Student demand, as I mentioned, employment, competition, and degree fit. Now, the first question you have to answer when you're doing market work is, what market? No point pulling data if it's not relevant to your institution. So to do that, we go in and look at where you're, and you can do this in mapping software is pretty easy to use these days. You take all your student addresses and you map them and you create what I like to call a chickenpox chart like this. And you can visually draw a circle here and understand what radius and therefore what geography you might need to cover in order to have all your students included. And in this case, a few fish there in Lake Michigan. After you gather that, you start to put them into buckets in histograms, the way we do it, and say, how far out do I have to go in order to get to 90% of my potential students? And you see how the curve here flattens out at a certain point. And if I add more distance at this point, I don't pick up a lot more students. You don't want to do that because if you include those, the flat part of the curve here, if you will, what'll happen is you're including a lot of market that's not really market you serve. And so that data will start to cloud the information that you're using to make program decisions. But the key point here is you have to go in and actually look at the data to figure out what market you want to gather data from, and then go get that data. Now, once you get to the data, you find a couple of other problems. Online and iPads is one of these cases. Each of these data sets, and now I'm talking about completions data that comes from iPads. iPads is the Integrated Post-Secondary Education Data System, I think. That's what the acronym means. I haven't seen the actual thing spelled out in so long. And what iPads does is there are all kinds of data in there reported by colleges by rule. If you collect Title IV funds, you have to file on iPads. One of the things that's filed is completions by academic program. So you can see what your competitors are up to and how many students are graduating from a program. Unfortunately, you can't see enrollment. And also, unfortunately, online students are reported in the headquarters location of the institution, not in the markets in which those students live and study. That creates a couple of problems. So the first part of the problem is that we're looking at completions, not enrollment. And the data only comes out every year in arrears by about a year. So right now, the most current data came out spring 2021. So we're looking at people who finished school in 2021. Well, that's already a couple of years out of date. And then if we think about it, those students made a decision about what academic program they wanted to take, but they didn't make that decision in 2021. They made it when they selected their major. So now we have to go back 3 or 4 years and say, okay, I picked my major sophomore year. So now and if I went through in 4 years, that data goes back to 2018. Now I begin to get worried. That means I'm looking at what students wanted in 2018. It's 2023. That information about what students want is 5 years out of date. And 2 of those years were COVID, which really changed how people behave. So in terms of trends, iPads is really very out of date and dangerous to work with. The second part is they're reporting those completions in the wrong place. So if I'm looking at Phoenix as an example, and I'll take not just the market, but the University of Phoenix as well. In 2021, they reported 30,750 completions in the city of Phoenix. 95% of those, according to the NC SARA database, where they have to report their actual enrollment by state, took place someplace else. Many of them in Southern California, as well as places all over the country, the East Coast, and you can see a hotspot down there in Florida as well. Well, that means that I've wildly overstated the number of graduates there are in the Phoenix market. And all these other markets, I'm underestimating the number of graduates in the available labor force, if nothing else, in those markets that's been trained in a particular discipline. So careful with iPads data, especially the iPads data around enrollment. It's not very current. And the online numbers are incorrect in terms of where those majors are located. Not what they majored in, that's fine, but it's misreporting where they're located. So you got to clean that up. And you can use NC SARA to do that, but it's a labor of love. When we did this, I thought it'd be pretty easy. You know, I've got this matrix, this table that tells me where those students are. Over there, I have my completion state. I just go back and forth and I'm done. It turned out that there are 1,500 academic programs, 50 states, 3,000 counties, 6 degree levels. And my guys told me when they were all done, it's 4 billion calculations to get these students from the markets where they're reported in iPads out to the places where they really are. So bit of a labor of love, but if you need to know what's really going on in your markets, it's very important. Now, I began to discuss this, iPads being, we're transitioning into student demand. And we look at student demand, there are 3 data sources that are out there that you can use. iPads is one, we talked about its issues. It's really backward, it's very old. And then you can sort of, if you will, evolve on this chart and look at enrollment data, which is pretty current. Enrollment data for us now is spring 2022, I believe. Yeah, that's right. So, you know, it's really pretty much up to date. And I'm not quite sure what this icon is over on the right-hand side. I think he's either rolling paint on the wall or that's a selfie stick, but this highly evolved icon is Google, and Google's actually forward-looking. That's the search volume of students who are online now looking for programs, but they're not going to enroll in all likelihood for 3 to 6 months. If it's at the doctoral level, that's actually 12 to 18 months between the time they start searching and when they actually come to school. So think of Google as a forward-looking indicator. iPads is very comprehensive, but very old, and enrollment being an indicator of current student interest and demand. So what are they interested in? Well, turns out they're interested in a lot of STEM. Actually 6 of the top 10 programs in terms of completion volume are STEM programs. 6 of the fastest growing programs are STEM programs: computer science, neuroscience, IT, computer engineering, information sciences, and biological engineering down here at the bottom. The fastest growing program in terms of completions is public health. But remember, completions is backward looking. So part of what we're picking up here is an increase in interest in public health that was driven by COVID. The more current numbers we can see in terms of enrollment and Google search volumes, as you suggested, that peak is past and public health is starting to trend down again. A couple of other hot programs over the last few years: supply chain or logistics, health services, and criminology. Well, despite those growing programs, fall enrollment was down overall 3% in 2022. The bright spot here is new student fall enrollment was up. So the total fell a little bit, but new students coming in were actually up slightly, which is wonderful. It's been a long time since I've seen an increase in enrollment, or an increase for that matter in other metrics around student demand. And we're finally starting to see that stuff show up in the data. So while we're not back to pre-pandemic levels, it is my hope, and the data can, hints that this might be true, that the decline is slowing down, if not stopped. However, that story varies a ton by degree level. So you always need to unpack the growth statistics and say, okay, well, what's happening at the degree levels that I'm involved in? And importantly, degree levels that I might want to get involved in order to participate in the growth. This has changed significantly as of fall to 2022. If you look backwards in enrollment statistics, traditionally what's been going on is the higher level degrees have been doing better. So there's been higher growth in doctoral degrees and master's degrees, and lower growth in lower level degrees. That trend's actually flipped. Associate's degrees, the last time I looked at enrollment, were down 20%. And here you can see they're up 3%. That's really the first time I've seen associate's degree grow in several years. Bachelor's degrees have been here, very, very large program, 1.5 million folks enrolled, hovering around 1 to 2% growth, so pretty flat. That's pretty consistent over time. And these non-degree credentials and certificates have been down, but 2 out of 3 here are bouncing back. Actually, 3 out of 4 are bouncing back: the undergrad certificates, non-credentials, and postmasters. And we get this one down here, post-bac certificates, that is still dropping 4%. But so overall, just to make sure we're clear, in this particular enrollment period, doctoral and master's degrees were down, associates and bachelor degrees were up, and most of our certificate programs are up. It's almost like somebody put a mirror to the data that we've been looking at over the last few years and flipped it. Because if I went back to this chart from 3 months ago, I'd see those higher level degrees at the top and the low level degrees below 0. So what is going on in enrollment? Well, notice STEM's a little bit less prevalent here. I've got biology making the chart, computer science, engineering, and mechanical engineering, but now we're down to just 4 out of our top 10. Number 1 by far is general studies. Now, of course, general studies really isn't a program. It's generally speaking what people are going to do before they major in a more specific field. But it may also be a degree from a community college, and it's one of the highest volume community college programs. So it's a little bit of what's going on in general studies. You can see business is clearly number 2, and it drops off 50% after that to get to biology. Psychology, also big, registered nursing, and what do we have else do we have here? Engineering and mechanical engineering, still in the top 10. Excuse me. What's growing? Tech. And I get computer science at the top of this list. Cybersecurity used to be a small program growing very fast. Now it's a big program growing very fast. And you can see the 4,500 puts in the top 4 in terms of new enrollment in fall 2022. Business is number 2. It's always been number 1, but now it's outstripped by computer science. Finance, number 3. And we work our way. Kinesiology is very large. Business analytics. And part of what we're seeing in business is these analytical programs are basically many times students who would have been business majors are now studying business analytics instead, and data science as well. Marketing and marketing management, mechanical engineering, and then a couple of health and fitness oriented things here: exercise physiology, health and phys ed, and I mentioned kinesiology a moment ago. So if I went back in this and looked at what was hot, if I went back a few years, tended to be healthcare. That's changing very rapidly. In particular, a couple of things here that are relatively new. The cybersecurity and business analytics moving on to this list, displacing some healthcare programs. February searches, Google did rise. So if you look at this, let me explain how to read the chart for a moment. We have months across the bottom. The light blue bars are the oldest data, 2021. The dark blue bars are 2022, and the aqua bars here are 2023. First thing to notice is the more recent years are above the prior years in every case. So we are seeing a steady uptick in Google search volumes for academic programs. Last month in February is up 3%. One other thought here that's really important. Many of you don't do advertising or marketing by program, especially small independents feel that they can't afford to do that. I'm not a marketer, but I don't buy into that mindset. If we were doing media advertising, TV and radio, it is indeed true that you can't afford to do it by program. I just can't afford to spend the money and develop all the different ads and so forth. But when you go online, you can buy keywords, and you can buy keywords for specific programs. And if nobody clicks on them, you don't pay for them. So there's very little risk to doing programmatic marketing as long as it doesn't fragment your marketing budget to the point where it's ineffective. But if you're not, if you have a program in psychology and you don't market it under those keywords, and a student's really interested in psychology, and they go online and they try to find the psychology programs in their state, you will not show up. All sorts of other schools will, but if you're not marketing against that keyword, you'll literally be invisible. So do keep that in mind. There are many students who search college brand first, and you'd show up in that search. But if they're really program oriented, if you're not marketing against programs, you're invisible. Let's switch over and talk about jobs. Now we're getting back to mythology again. So here is a fundamental misconception that haunts program evaluation and a lot of labor market statistics. And it's this concept of direct preparation. So many of you have heard that history majors are unemployable. Now, you're listening to a history major, so I take umbrage at that. And by the time you're done listening to me, you may think that actually history majors should have been unemployable. But put that aside for a moment and bear with me. The National Center for Education Statistics, NCES, does this direct prep crosswalk data. And they go in and their labor market statisticians sit around the table and they decide what you're trained for when you study history. Now, let's start at the bottom where it's kind of logical. Secondary school teachers, sure. A lot of history majors will become teachers. History teachers, yep, that makes sense. Historians, well, it's logical, but there are only about 4 jobs for historians in the United States. So I would guess that not a lot of history majors become historians. Managers, all other. Well, I don't even know what that is, but yeah, some of us probably become managers. But my personal favorite here is tour guides. Okay, I can live with that. But escorts, that's kind of a stretch for history majors. Not many history majors that I knew would have passed as escorts, but maybe they mean some different kind of escort. So there we have it. You know, history majors have got 5 jobs. 3 out of the 5, there are almost no jobs available. And all of the things we're looking here, except possibly managers, other, don't pay particularly well. I should also make an exception there for the escorts. They probably get well paid. All right, so what do we really do? I mean, you can look at that and say, well, that's just not right. I don't know any of my colleagues who are history majors who did several of those fields. So what we find when you look at the American Community Survey, which is a subset of the census, they survey some 2.5 million people every 10 years. And they ask a few key questions. One is, what was your undergraduate major? A second question is, what are you doing? What's your occupation? And then they ask pay, and they ask over 100 other questions as well. So we take that data about what was your major and what are you getting paid and what do you do? And we analyze that to say, okay, well, what do history majors really do? They don't go into 5 fields. They go into 502 fields. One of them isn't arithmetic, because as you can see, 398, 5 doesn't add to 502. That should be 498. And that's my bad. So you can tell I really am a history major, business school notwithstanding. Anyway, lawyers, number 1. And that's true, as I mentioned, for philosophy. Teachers, they got that one right. Some more teachers, check. There are those managers, those other managers. I guess that includes me. Secondary school teachers, sure. Education administrators. Oh, we become CEOs too. I don't think anybody kind of included that over there in the majors. Management analysts, few of us become clergy. The list goes on for 500 other professions approximately. So the idea that there's no jobs for history majors is bunk. There are lots of jobs, you do lots of things. Many of us do have to go to grad school. In this case, mostly law. I happen to have gone to business school. The other thing people say is we don't earn any money. That's also untrue. On average, history majors earn $106,000, which puts us at the 80th percentile in US income, according to the census. So keep that in mind. And anybody who wants this chart, so you can sit down with incoming people who are thinking about history and say, there's a future after a history major, let me know. I would be glad to share this data with you. Now, you may well say, well, that's true for history, but other than history, I think those numbers are probably, the NCS crosswalk is probably right. Well, let me explain how to read the chart. Across the bottom, we have the percentage of graduates who enter the fields for which they were directly prepared. So if I'm over here at the 80 to 100 percentile, that would be in those programs, 80 to 100% of the people went into the direct prep fields. The y-axis here, count of programs, is how many programs fall into that bucket. So you can see at the 80% or higher of people going into their direct prep fields, we don't have any. Look at that. Nobody actually goes in the fields for which they're directly prepared. Well, it's not quite right. We've got some programs here where 60 to 79% of the graduates go in to the fields for which they're directly prepared. But to cut to the chase, 493 out of the 634 programs that you can observe in the ACS survey, less than 20% of the grads went into fields for which they're directly prepared. So that's 2/3 of all programs. Less than a fifth of the graduates are going to go into jobs for which they're directly prepared. So be super careful. You know what the crosswalk is that lives behind your data about what graduates do for your programs. Chances are it's wrong, and it's not wrong by a little bit. If I think of history, if I were off by 10%, that's great. For work like this, that's not a problem. But when I have to multiply by 100 to correct the number, that's a bit of a problem. So keep that in mind. And you might say, well, I'm a community college, so yeah, history majors don't do what they're supposed to do. Do auto techs and other tradesmen? The answer is kinda, but not as much as you might hope. We looked at 151 graduates of automotive training programs. This is from a database that we acquired of some 70 million people. And it too contains what their majors were and what their jobs have been. So it actually tracks over a number of different time periods. Within that, what we found for auto techs is 49% of auto techs are currently working in direct prep fields. So the majority are actually not doing auto tech work. And when we say auto tech, we don't just mean people with wrenches. That includes service managers, sales associates, other things where that auto tech experience is relevant and may have helped them get the job. So a minority, over the span of a career, a minority of them can actually end up being in auto tech at any one time. What else do they do? The answer is really all over the place. Military, retail, defense and space, higher education, and so forth. Now,
Bob, we have a quick question. How easy is it to discern this ACS data?
Not very easy. You can go get it, but it's 2.5 million records. So if you've got somebody that's good with databases, you can download the data and cut it yourself. You can't do it in Excel. Excel will collapse. So you'll need a decent database management system to analyze it. So it's doable, but it's not easy. And let me see, where's it going with this? So one of the things you want to think about here is what's going on. And we have a really interesting ideological conundrum here. The folks who think that we ought to be focusing higher ed more on career and technical fields, and that we ought to be doing the things that are growing, ironically, unintentionally, are taking a, if you will, communist perspective on this, that we can centrally plan our economy and predict what the folks we need. And we can say, okay, we're going to need this many people who make buggy whips, therefore we must train this many people to make buggy whips. And then you get there and you find out nobody makes buggy whips anymore. So I look at the left-hand side of this chart and I say that is the wonder of capitalism. People figure out where the opportunities are and they go after them. I think two lessons for higher ed in this, and when you're thinking about programs, one is be sure your graduates have the foundational skills they may need when they either decide they don't want to do what they're doing anymore, or that job goes away and they need to transition to something else. The other is, I'm afraid I can't help you too much with, we'll get to this in a second, very hard to predict this stuff and to predict the economy. So it's important that in your program portfolio, you maintain as much flexibility as you reasonably can, because you just don't know where the world's going to head. And those who think we can plan all this out, I think the world did that test a while back, and it didn't work out too well for the Soviet Union and a number of other folks who tried to, if you will, centrally plan and administer their economies. So what do these auto techs really do? Well, first, after they get out of the program, in this case, this is one graduate, did become an auto tech for a while, then went to the military, then became an estimator, and finally ended up in construction management, where some of those technical skills are still relevant, the ability to use sophisticated measurement systems and so forth, use tools, all that's potentially relevant there, but not exactly what he trained for. And I mentioned philosophy. I won't walk through this. We've talked about it, but the same thing here. They do just fine. What's going on in job postings? They're down now. They're down in the last couple months. What we're really seeing here is that job postings dropped off the face of the earth during COVID. Then they made a huge rally and increased a lot. And now what's happening is we're anniversarying that unnatural burst of job posting that happened post-COVID. So the numbers are a bit down from that, but still pretty healthy. If we could find, it went back to 2019 and sort of look for normal job volumes. So my suspicion here is that while it's down compared to last year when that wave of job postings was coming through post-COVID, it's still a pretty healthy level. So what's hot? General managers. You'll always see nursing on this chart, computer users, human resources, a lot of sort of general fields. But what I see that's different here is the interest in hiring managers, whether that's general and operations managers, marketing managers, management analysts, and construction managers. I think people are trying to refill the management ranks after COVID. So let's take a look at a program scorecard. This is sort of the heart of the program evaluation process. First things first, we color code. So you see this is green. That means it's in the 98th or 99th percentile if it's dark green. By the time you get down to pink, it's not so great. These happen to be in the 20th percentile. So that's a combination of percentiling our data, where we compare each program and each metric to 1,500 other programs on the same metric.
Real quick,
and then we align the color codes with those.
We have a quick question. Most CTE programs aren't necessarily co-joined with community colleges. Is your data pulling from CTE schools, community colleges, or CCs with on-site CTE schools? For example, Johnson Community College in Kansas.
Well, with JCCC, that the CTE program would be reported in all likelihood through JCCC. So the community college and the career and technical program from a reporting perspective would be the same. But let's assume that's not the case. We will pick up career and technical education programs for any Title IV receiving institution. So in most fields, that's at pretty much everybody. There are CTE programs where that's not as reliable, and you need to do some other homework. So things like cosmetology, there are private for-profits that take credit cards in payment. They wouldn't report into iPads, and therefore we might miss them. Overall, it's a small number, but in specific fields, those non-iPads competitors can be very material. I mentioned cosmetology. There are a handful of others where a good one would be some of the dental specialties, where they'll come into the dentist office on the weekend and put out their credit card and learn to become, what's it called? It's not a hygienist, you need a program for that, but a dental assistant. And they can get that degree, and you might not see that. But by and large, the vast majority are going to be in there. So two key takeaways here. One, you need to rank your programs, and you need to have as many in there as you can handle. That gives you context with which to understand the numbers. Without a program to compare to, very difficult to interpret programmatic numbers. And you're probably not going to do what we do and gather all 1,500, and it'd just be way too much time and effort. But you can gather data about your programs, and so that you can compare a new program to your current programs, and you can compare within your program portfolio to understand which are in high demand, for example, and which may not be. If you can't do all your current programs, then what I would suggest is go in and do a handful that are what I would call mainstream programs, potentially from different departments. That way you can compare other programs to those, and again, be able to interpret the data that, so that that you're, I'll pick one. Don't pick your biggest programs, by the way, and your most successful, because that's going to make everything look bad. You want to pick something that's sort of in the high middle of your program mix. I don't know, I pick history just because it's history. And then you can compare other programs to that and see if they are likely to do better or worse based on the numbers compared to the numbers in a history program. That's probably not the best example I could have picked. So let's take a look at business management in particular across these 4 dimensions of student demand, competition, employment, and degree fit. On demand, you can see it's all dark green. That suggests a very big program. In fact, it's at the 99th percentile in Google search volume, the 100th percentile in international page views, the 100th percentile, it's the largest program that is in terms of new student enrollment. On ground is enormous as well, number 1. Online completions, actually at 99th percentile. So let's pause there. That means a very big online program. So in this program, we're going to be facing a lot of online competition. Is it growing? Well, now the story's not so great. Google search volumes, 0th percentile, actually the lowest program in terms of unit growth. Part of that just it's also the biggest program. So when it goes down, it posts very big unit volume changes. And you can see that that's actually not that big a percentage decline, just down 2%. So big units, small percentage because it's such a large program. New student enrollment, on the other hand, is up, and it's one of the largest programs in terms of enrollment growth. Not percentage growth, but still very healthy in terms of student enrollment. So that's the more current indicator. And finally, completions are fine. So if I look at this, I'm concerned. I'm getting conflicting readings about whether this program is growing or not. Historical numbers are looking good. The future numbers, what Google's suggesting is that we're going to see a decline in interest in business programs. But still enormous. If you're not in it, big opportunity here. Just be aware that you may be swimming upstream in a market that's flat to declining. Now, the good news is very recently, the Google search volume is up 7%. So that longer term year-over-year trend is changing. Now let's take a look at employment. And let's start at the bottom of this. This had pretty heavy direct prep. So most people who study business go into it, 33%, not most, but more than usual. And it pays well, $96,000 a year. So are there a lot of jobs? Yeah, there are a lot of direct prep jobs, 100th percentile. There are also a lot of non-direct prep jobs, which we capture by using that ACS data to inform our crosswalk. So however you cut it, it's very large. Growth rates are intriguing here. The growth rate has been about 2.6%. This is one of the rare cases where the Bureau of Labor Statistics was dead on with its forecast. And it said it was going to be up 2.6%. Indeed, it was, until last year where it dropped 1%. Now, you might well ask yourself, what happened? Are there fewer jobs for those history majors, or is something else going on? Well, here's an interesting indicator. There are 14.8 job postings for every business graduate. So the problem here isn't that there's a shortage of job opportunities. Problem is that there's a shortage of people to hire. In fact, we have 6 million job postings for 12 million jobs. 12 million people employed. That's nearly 50 job postings for about half the labor force. So there are plenty of jobs out there. There are not enough people to fill them. And that may explain why we have this 1% drop in employment. It's not that they're not trying to hire people, it's they can't.
Bob, quick question. How do you link the search data to the program enrollment and completions? Do you have a crosswalk between the two data sets?
We do indeed. And that is a labor of love. So we went out for the search data and found 20 search terms. We've actually been through this process a couple of times now to get it cleaned up for each of about 900 programs. that comprise over 90% of all completions. And then we run that through Google once a month by county, for each of those, 18,000 search terms by county every month to see what the trend is. Top occupations, not a lot of surprises here. We got a lot of managers and accountants and CEOs. So I'm going to keep moving in the interest of time. They do, by the way, make a little less than history and philosophy majors. Competitive intensity. Now we get to some interesting and less wonderful statistics. Highest number of campuses graduates, not surprisingly, almost everybody has a business program. Median program size, however, is very large. So even though there are a lot of people offering it, you can still fill a classroom. In fact, they're on average 37, not on average. The median school has 37 people graduating every year in this program. So think of that as, times 4 plus attrition. Maybe that's 180, 200 students in the business program at the median institution. So it's good size. No surprise there. No change in units. So while we're seeing a little bit of unevenness in those growth forecasts, the programs that are out there are not shrinking. Google cost per click, however, is at the 97th percentile, confirming this is a very competitive program. So here I'd start to say, I'd be a little worried that maybe this market's saturated. If I have a program, I'm not going to really be able to expect it to grow unless I'm really good at marketing. If I haven't got a program, this makes it a little riskier to get into the space because it may already be full up. So degree fit's pretty straightforward. Most of this is going to happen at the bachelor's and master's level. This is one where master's is a very common level for this program, at 28% of all completions. In terms of hiring, it's actually across the board from people who are working in these areas have every level of college attainment, from none up to doctoral, although very few at the doctoral level.
Real quick question. So the higher
Yep.
the score in competition, the worse off it is for considering a program addition or growth?
Right now, the way it works is a high score on competition is a bad thing. It means there's a lot of it until you get up here to the overall score. But we're probably going to reverse that in the next few months. So it's more logical, and a low score is because the scores will line up the way they do for everything else, where high is good and low is bad. We will subtract 1 from the percentiles for this so that it makes it a little clearer. So I mentioned through here. So we put all that together on a scorecard. And now I'm going to really pick up the pace. And we do this so that you have one page you can go to when people are trying to make these decisions. It is very busy. You get good at this, though, and looking at it, you know where the data is, and your eye can quickly get drawn to the strengths and weaknesses of a program. Dark green, lots of dark green. I know it's big. A whole bunch of blue here means a lot of these metrics are kind of around average. And then my eye comes down here to competition. I see there's quite a bit of it, and that would worry me. So let's switch over and start talking about program economics. And now we're shifting from data that comes from outside the institution about markets to data from inside the institution about margins. First things first, what data do you need? We would argue to understand and make decisions about academic programs, you need to understand direct instructional economics. So that does not include indirect costs by and large. Not that they're not relevant, but well, they actually are. For program decisions, most of your overheads won't change. So you want to focus in on the impact your decision may have on the financials of the institution. And that's the direct instructional revenue and cost. How do you do that? You start at the student level. And for each individual student, you need to know how much they paid, what additional fees they may have paid beyond tuition. Oftentimes there's a little bit of other revenue. And then you subtract out of that any money that you've given them in scholarships that are not funded out of dedicated scholarship funds from your endowment. And you subtract that out. So now I've got a net revenue for each student. Then what I need to do, and many of you may say, well, I want to use average discounts per student credit hour because that's fair. It's a heck of a lot easier than trying to dig up the discounts each individual student got. The problem is, while you may not explicitly give discounts for particular programs, in practice, the scholarship money ends up being very different depending on the academic program, often in ways that are, at least were not obvious to me. So one axis of that might be, well, what if you're in Division I and your athletes are getting scholarships, you'd expect all the programs the athletes tend to cluster in to have high discount rates. The thing that was surprising to me is many schools are going to offer heavy discounts for their honors program. So the other cluster of high discounts tends to be in actually fairly challenging academic material where your honors students tend to cluster. So I would just say you got to understand discount at the student level, so you really understand what's going on in your school and in the individual program. Then you do a very similar thing to understand instructional costs. You look at the salary of your instructors, you look at the benefits, you add in any additional pay they may have, and then there may be some non-personnel costs associated with a given course. For example, a biolab is likely to have disposable items that are associated with it that are a variable cost of offering that program. Now, one of the challenges here is when you look at what faculty do, they don't just teach. So before you estimate the cost of teaching, you have to subtract out the cost of the faculty's time spent on other activities. If they're a dean, they have a bunch of activity associated with being a dean. And most faculty members are going to have some sort of service obligation that takes them out of the classroom. And in many institutions have a very substantial research obligation that should not be charged to their day-to-day teaching responsibilities. So we subtract all of that out at the beginning, either using your load tables or what I call the woodchuck method, where we say, if a professor only taught students, how many courses could a professor teach? So a standard load, think of that as perhaps they have to teach a full-time professor at a given institution might teach 4 courses, and that is going to vary from institution to institution. But if they're supposed to teach 4 and they only are teaching 3, then we would take a quarter of their load and a quarter of their cost and assign it out to whatever they're doing with that other quarter of their time. That might be administrative activities or any one of a number of other research or whatever. But we peel that out first. And then we take the remainder and we allocate it to the courses that instructor teaches based on that individual course's share of total credit hours taught by the instructor.
Bob, do we include self-pay and international students? Sorry, do we exclude self-pay and international students?
No. And as long as they're contributing revenue and they're using a seat in a class, they would be in the revenue and they would be allocated cost for instruction. Now, here comes an important concept. We're then going to take that expense and we're going to allocate that out to the individual students that are taking the course. And some of those students will be in accounting, if we're using accounting as the example, but many will not. Again, our history majors crop up here. So some of the cost for teaching accounting and the revenue is going to get assigned out to the history department because that person's major is history. They just happen to be taking a course over here to fulfill the major. Another way I do this with nursing, nurses have to take English. So when we're looking at programmatic economics, we're counting the economics of the English course as part of the economics of the nursing program because the student came to school to take nursing. If it weren't for nursing, there'd be nobody that student wouldn't be in the English course. This is not the only way to count. It's just the right way to count when you're trying to make program decisions. When you're trying to do cost analysis and so forth, you may want that same revenue, cost, and margin back over in the English department. When you're making program decisions, you want to look at the English revenue, cost, and margin in the nursing program where that student's actually majoring. Then you can allocate all sorts. So another important point here is clear visual math. Many of the people you're going to try and communicate with aren't, in fact, interested in numbers and may not have done them since high school. And so you want to be very careful that you communicate this in a very clear way. That's why we use the colors. That's why we do simple waterfalls like this. So you can see gross tuition and fees, less discounts is what means net revenue. And then I take my instructional cost and I can see my contribution. So it's very self-explanatory. And that's really important because a lot of the people you're going to talk to aren't finance people. They're professors, they're English professors. And they need to be able to understand this as well as anybody else. Then you can, if you want, get in the business of allocating overheads to programs. I honestly don't recommend it. I think there's a much simpler way to do this. Many people want to, and the systems can support it. It's not wrong. but it is very tendentious. You'll end up spending all your time talking about allocation methodologies instead of talking about the part of the economics that the academic part of the institution controls, which are these. So I'll give you a shorthand for doing overhead. Look at your educational cost, that direct educational expense for teaching. Compare it to your total cost for the institution. Typically, it's going to run around 33%. So for a program to be fully profitable, it's got to have 66% margin to pay for all the other stuff that has to go on in the institution, like admissions or the president's salary. It's much easier to say that, and then everybody's aiming for the same number. At 66% margins, my program pays all the bills. And you don't end up in this endless dialogue about whether I should be allocating it based on student headcount, program size, or the number of angels that can dance on the head of a pin.
Bob, another quick question.
Yep.
Quick.
We're going to run a little overtime here. I hope people can bear with.
Do you account for the number of students per course section, i.e. faculty teaching 120 students over 3 sections versus one teaching 5 sections and 50 students?
We account for each student in each section. The cost per student credit hour, however, is going to vary by the number of students in each section. So if I'm a faculty member and I teach 2 sections with 20 each, that's going to cost twice as much, and the student credit hours are going to be, the cost per student credit hour is going to be twice as high as one section with the same professor teaching 40 students in that section. Hope that wasn't too confusing. More students, lower cost. That's basically what that nets out to. When you get through all this work, you're going to find some things that surprised us. Maybe other people knew this in advance, but in many states, they'll say, okay, we got to cut the small programs because they must be losing money. When we looked at it, if you take this left-hand corner of this chart and blow it out, most of the money-losing programs, almost all of them here, are small. We got a couple of big ones that are losing money, but there are more programs that are small that make money. This is contribution, not full profit. Then there are small programs that lose money. So be super careful using program size as a shortcut for financial decisions. If you cut any one of these dots up here, your revenue will fall faster than your cost. You'll be worse off after you're cut than you were before. So keep that in mind. You need to run the numbers. Small does not mean negative contribution. In some cases, small programs are actually fully profitable. Then you want to do some comparisons to see if your costs are in line. Oftentimes, these are done by department. We compare one department to another. And when you do that, you're going to have departments that scream like minks. And they're actually kind of right. The cost of teaching, let's say, business is very different than the cost of teaching music, where I have to have individual instruction. So this is a case where comparisons are actually kind of odious. They're not irrelevant, by the way, but they're going to create a lot of heat. And a lot of the concerns are actually reasonably correct. That comparing what it costs to teach bio, which has labs, with English, which doesn't, not really terribly relevant. For that, you need to go outside the 4 walls. We keep data right now in about 40 schools and thousands of programs and tens of thousands of courses. We can actually cut it down to the point where we're looking at course, subject, and course level and comparing things. We're talking very much like to like. So we can compare, and you really need to do that. You need to know how much should it be costing me to run a 100 level course in, say, music. And what you find, I'm going to take music, is that, first of all, this green is a 25th percentile, the blue is a median, and the red is a 75th percentile, and that's the benchmark. And the black is an individual fictional client. So these guys are below the median, which looks good. The other thing I see on this chart, though, is there's enormous range in the cost to teach music. This is not an area where there's any consistency. And there's no a priori reason to believe the guys are spending more actually running a better program. So it's a little bit all over the place. And when you look at your own programs, you want to keep those bars close, because that means that you're under control, that the cost of your programs aren't just all over the map. When you do this, you'll find the answers are not intuitive. The line here is the average, and then you can see the percentage above or below average of a program, keeping in mind that all the programs in this page are actually contribution positive. So the red doesn't mean that they're losing money. It means that they're that's how the percentage below the average that they're falling. So history, for example, is 20% below average, 10% below average margin approximately. What I found surprising out of the benchmark is registered nursing is actually well above the median in terms of margin. It's almost over 40% higher than average. So, and then you can put all this together, and because you have data at the student level, you can start to append all sorts of other information and be able to cut it in different ways. This is an example of looking at the FW rates. I can see what my trend is over time. In here, it's difficult to see, but I can see it by ethnicity and gender. I can look at it by department. I can cut it by program. And all this is built off the fact that my core data is kept at the individual student level, which means I can append things to it and then aggregate it any way I want. In the end, what you want to be able to do is understand whether you're in attractive markets, whether the margins are high, and then we color code to indicate mission alignment. And the ideal program portfolio would have a whole bunch of very dark bubbles over here in attractive markets with high margin, attractive markets, large margins, and large area size. That's the program size. But you're going to have some where the market's not great. This is a great program. I have a small market. I'm probably not going to be able to grow it, but very high margin. And it's right on mission. Where I get worried is something like this, which is actually in a big market. It's not on mission and it's losing money. I have a couple choices there. One is not on mission, probably shouldn't be cross-subsidizing if it's not on mission. And that may be a program I want to slim down or exit. The other alternative is to say, wait a second, it is small, but it's in a great market. Maybe what I should be doing is trying to grow that program, because if it's not on mission, it better produce some margin.
Another quick question, Bob. Should there be an immediate 1 to 3 years ROI on new programs? If not, how soon should programs see financial growth?
I don't think there's a rule of thumb for that. I'm not going to take you into all the financial metrics, but your finance department could. What you want to look at is return on investment. So for every dollar I invest, how many dollars do I get back? And then you have to do some math to figure out $1 5 years from now is not worth the same amount as $1 right now. So you have to do what's called a discounted present value analysis. That's very standard stuff. If anybody doesn't know how to do that, you can call us. Your finance guys will all know how to do it. But there's a way a business plan is done, and you should look at it, say not whether I'm going to break even in 3 to 5 years. It may turn out it's a 5-year investment, but by the time I get to year 4 and 5, it's paying me a huge amount of money, and it's worth suffering through. Other instances, you're going to look at it, it's going to break even very quickly, but the total return might not be very good. So when you get out to year 5, it's still kind of marginal. There are all kinds of different profiles a program could have that would make it more or less attractive financially, aside from how long it takes to build. Nursing is easily going to take you 3 years just to get it off the ground. But once you have those programs, they tend to be large. And as I mentioned a minute earlier, very high margin. And there are lots of different growing fields within nursing. So might be worth it there because the long-term ROI is very high. In practice, I think if you need to, let me reframe that question. If the concern is I need to improve my financials quickly, launching new programs is generally not the method to do that. Launching new programs is more a matter of ensuring that in the medium to long term, I can add students. In the short term, what you got to do is grow programs where you've already got the accreditation, you've got the faculty and so forth. And you need to you need to either make the program in some way more attractive or do a better job of marketing it, or get out there and have the professors, and many schools do this, have department heads get out and recruit students for their particular program. So short term, it's about growing programs you have. New programs are more of a longer term investment, though usually much more substantial opportunities. So once you got them, you got to manage them. And the first step in that is running a program evaluation workshop. And this is where you make those choices about what new programs to offer, what current programs to grow, which ones maybe have outlived their sell-by date. We need to think about reducing resource commitment or perhaps even phasing them out. But 70 to 80% of your programs are going to be fine. They fall into a category you could call sustain. Some are you're going to need to fix. You may need to come up with a more benign name than fix. One of the categories I heard yesterday I liked was support. They need some kind of support to make them better. You've got to review this stuff regularly. I know this is going to sound terribly onerous, but looking at your programs every 5 years really isn't enough. If you automate the data, you can be looking at things much more frequently and stay on top of what's going on with your programs so that you can make better resource allocation decisions. And those could fall in lots of buckets. So, for example, marketing decisions, spend a little bit more money on this program. You need to be looking at that almost continuously, but certainly quarterly. So you catch a trend like that growth we talked about before in public health. And then when public health starts to trend down post-pandemic, you can see that quickly enough to ratchet back your spending on marketing, which is not going to be as productive. And also potentially look at your adjunct staff, for example, and say, well, I may need to cut back a little bit there because the demand for that particular program is waning. So there are things you can do in the short term to better manage your resources by keeping track of those measures that are relatively volatile that indicate what's going to happen in the relatively short term. Now, you're not going to evaluate your whole curriculum to do that. And you're certainly not going to make decisions to launch new programs based on a couple months of growth or something like that. You want to look at your student outcomes and other critical metrics more like once a year to make sure the program is doing what it's supposed to do. And then for really big curriculum decisions for fundamental reallocation of resources, those tend to be longer term decisions and less frequent. To support all that, you need a program report card where most of the data you need is automated so you can take a look at these metrics without tying up your staff for weeks or months to pull the data together. What does that look like? Well, at the provost level or dean, you're going to be able to have sort of a dashboard that's pretty high level and covers all your programs. And you can come in here and, for example, sort on what's going on in Google and see, okay, so now I've sorted, so my best ones come to the top. Google's up 21%. So I should be thinking, wait a second, I may be looking at enrollment growth here. Have I got the resources to support that in psychology? Median program sizes are up. Okay, I've got more support that the external market would suggest this is growing. Now I look at internal and I find I'm up 36 students enrolled in an increase of over 10%. My graduation numbers are up. A little worrisome here, my DFW rate's 30%. Good return rate from prior year. Then I'm going to just come over here and say, well, if I'm worried about resources, do I have reason to believe this might be under-resourced when I'm looking at my best programs? And indeed, I find I'm running at $126 per credit hour, and that's actually $13 below benchmark. So if my dean of psychology comes to me and says, I need more faculty, I should be receptive there potentially because I'm actually running this pretty lean and it's growing and it looks like it's going to continue growing. And of course, if in our system, if I re-clicked on that, I could pull up all the ones where Google's declining and be looking at areas where I may be over-resourced or I may have some other problem like my failure rate's too high. So this is a way of being able to look at all your programs efficiently and identify the handful that really need urgent attention. And we pull all that data for the individual program manager and perhaps for a dean. We can look at each program on a single page and have a summary of all those metrics: markets, margins, academics, overall program size, mission, and goals. And that's what you see here with very summary statistics from each of the supporting applications. And I think most important here, we're getting data from the faculty on how this program aligns with mission, what the goals of the program are, and whether we're on track. And below the fold, on a page like this, we keep track of actions, what the status is of those planned actions, what issues may be arising on an ongoing basis. This is a huge help when accreditation rolls around. You'll have 5 years of history that say, here were the numbers when we started, here are the goals and actions we committed to, here are the numbers that we got to as a result of those goals and actions. So tremendous time saver when you get into accreditation. And that's my pitch. So I hope that's very helpful to all of you. I apologize for running over. It's a ton of material to cover. And if you'd like to have time to go think about this in greater depth, there are several different resources you can tap. One is the course that we offer through BayPath. It's about $900. I don't remember the precise price, but much of this data and a lot more in that course with a variety of faculty members that teach it. And it's a way for those of you who need to really be deep experts in this to go and get additional information. The book is out there, and it's an easy way. You know, if we've gone through this too fast for you today, a copy of the book will help you to process all of that. And then finally, we run webinars all the time, and you can come in and join those. They're free, and you know, they help keep you up to date on what's going on in the market. So lots of ways to get deeper and keep up to date on what's going on, most of which are actually free or close to it. That's it.
Last
No,
but
I
not
think
least,
that-
we will see you all next Tuesday when we do a little bit more of our masterclass section 2. So looking forward to see all you next week. Thank you so much.